County Durham's Police and Crime Commissioner says he's in favour of providing space for drug addicts to inject heroin without fear of prosecution. Ron Hogg told us earlier that he's not condoning illegal drug use, but had become convinced of the merits of drug consumption rooms after studying research in other countries.
It takes out the criminality from the whole process, so that not committing crime, taking drug dealers off the streets, and taking money out of the pockets of organised crime groups.
Let's talk to a couple of people who have got the inside track on this and know a little bit more than the average person. Martin Hull is the medical director at Swanswell, the Coventry and Leicestershire-based alcohol charity who's in favour of these schemes. And Simon Stevens is the director of casework for Addictions UK, who's got reservations. Gents, thanks to the both of you for being with us. Good morning. If I can start with you first of all, Martin. You like this as an idea? You think this could work?
Well, yeah, I think it can. I mean, I think that there's a strong evidence base for these sort of rooms, and certainly at Swanswell we support evidence-based practice and are very keen on looking into our options for this sort of thing. So yeah, I think it's certainly an option for something that we could consider, yeah.
Is it a big part of drug addiction problems, this idea that, you're going to be harassed by the police, or there's nowhere safe or, clinically safe as well for you to be able to shoot up? Is that? I would have thought there were other more pressing issues around drug use than that.
Well, I think you're right. I think there are more pressing issues possibly, but I think what this is probably talking about is a small section of drug users who are probably the most vulnerable, possibly homeless people who haven't really got anywhere safe to inject, and it's looking into providing them with somewhere safe, somewhere where they can be clinically supervised, where the risk of overdose is lower, and also with the possible public benefits of reducing things like needle litter. So whilst I think you're right, I think this doesn't apply to the vast majority of drug users. I think it's something which we could look into for a small minority of the most vulnerable drug users.
Simon, what are your reservations?
My reservations do reflect what Martin's just said, that it does. It's looking at a small number of drug users, and according to statistics now, the use of heroin is falling. My fear is that such provisions will turn out to be very expensive.
Can I just ask you, do we know why heroin use is falling? Because I read that earlier on, and I thought, hang on, do we know why is that? Because are we doing something right that it's falling?
I think, yes, we are doing something right, but I think youth culture and culture in general is turning. Addiction itself isn't falling, it's just expressing itself with different drugs.
Which has always been the way, hasn't it? I mean, it
has indeed.
Yeah, if you look at young people and drug use and abuse, it's whatever the fad is at the time. So it's going out of fashion, essentially, you're saying, Simon?
To some degree, it will always be there and it will always be a problem. My take on this, that it's basically a maladjusted evolutionary trait that kind of transacts with the environment, that we need to have psychological interventions and we need to aim towards abstinence. The problem with drug rooms, and they do have benefits, I'm not arguing that they don't have benefits, but the problem is that they can be seen as enabling addicts. They can be seen as saying, this is okay. Another problem is, where do you cite them? Will they be used if you simply have one drug room in a city? Will people further away from that drug room, will they actually use it because they have to have a bus trip to get there to use? My experience is that addicts tend to use very quickly after getting their drugs. Other things will be the restrictions placed within the drug rooms as to whose drugs you can use, how much you can use. The more restricted it becomes, and quite perhaps in a good way, in the sense we're trying to help people not hurt themselves, the less likely it is that the addicts are going to use those rooms. So you could end up with a situation where you've expended a large part of the available budget to treat everybody with addiction issues, and bearing in mind we're talking about only a minority of people in this particular area, that a large part of the budget has been used unsuccessfully. I do see that potentially, yes, it can reduce bloodborne diseases, it can reduce needle litter, but, the vast number of people with addictions are hidden from public view, and they're people, for example, with alcohol addictions or with prescribed drug addictions or with other addictions with other drugs. We should be seeing this from a health perspective and treating the misery of individuals and their families of people who have got, this illness of addiction.
But Martin, it's interesting. What Simon was saying was borne out earlier by Kervin Julian. You probably know Kervin, do you? I'm not sure whether you've come across him, but he's an ex-drug user.
Yeah.
And he was saying, talking about what Simon was saying, the enabling side of this. And just to be clear, so you both know what Ron Hoggy's saying. Ron Hoggy's saying, and he said to me this morning, we're talking about actually providing the drugs as well. So not only providing the room, providing... Isn't Simon right? It's a bit enabling, isn't it? People think, I've never tried heroin.
Yeah,
I think I'll pop along.
The evidence of drug consumption rooms are common in other countries. There are over 90 drug consumption rooms around the world. And the evidence doesn't seem to suggest that people are initiating drug use by going to these rooms. What we're talking about really is people who are already taking these drugs, taking them in a safe and controlled environment where their risk of overdose and therefore death as a result of that is significantly reduced. And so I think that to me is one of the most compelling arguments, is keeping people alive and therefore enabling them to move on their recovery journey by starting to engage people in treatment, and also providing people with those rooms and therefore contact with the health services is therefore giving people the opportunity to move into more conventional forms of treatment. So whilst I agree with lots of what Simon was saying, I think that this is a kind of I don't think it's as expensive as it may well be deemed to be. I think that providing a room where people can take their own drugs isn't a highly expensive thing. What the police commissioner is talking about is a little bit different, and that's providing people with prescribed diamorphine or prescribed heroin.
Yeah.
And that's a slightly different thing, in that that's actually something which is going on in the UK at the moment. There are trials and pilot sites where that's happening, and there's semantic differences to that, in that people are assessed that that's the most suitable form of treatment for them, and that's a separate issue to the one that I think we're talking about.
You see, I have to, and the other thing that leaves me a bit uncomfortable, Simon, I wonder whether it's safe to draw parallels between what's happening in Europe and what happens in the UK. You've only got to look at the way that Europeans consume alcohol in a very different way to the British, and think, well, presumably, do they consume drugs in the same way?
That's going to be an interesting point. You have to then start making distinctions between people who consume drugs as a lifestyle choice and people who consume drugs because they have the illness of addiction, and that's quite a complicated argument. Some of the things you might look at is paralleling this proposal with, for example, we have a huge problem with people who binge drink.
Yeah.
We know that. Costs far more, and it's far more of a problem, really, than drugs.
But the Europeans don't, do they?
They don't. But what I was going to say is, would we tolerate the idea of rooms where you could go along, get free alcohol and drink in them?
Yeah.
We might say, no, that sounds a little crazy.
Well, do you know, and I have to say, and I put this point to Ron Hogg earlier, I wouldn't want to be the one who's got to explain to the taxpayer, Martin, that we're going to buy people's heroin for them and provide them a room and provide them needles and sit there while they're sticking it in their arm.
Well, I think there are arguments around that if you're thinking about purely on cost, that there are huge cost benefits of this sort of treatment, both, from the reduction in acquisitive crime all the way through to the health benefits of...
Even the cost aside, though, socially it seems wrong to me.
Sure.
I mean, I don't know, you work in this environment, so you know better than I do, and I'll bow to your superior knowledge, but somewhere inside me, it seems wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's why having this debate is a useful and helpful thing to do. I mean, obviously we can talk about the medical evidence of benefits, but this needs to be something which socially, politically is acceptable. To my mind, I don't really have a fundamental problem with trying to enable people who've become dependent on a substance to start to take the steps in their journey to stop being dependent on that substance. And if an initial step in that journey is a provision of safe pharmaceutical diamorphine rather than buying from dealers and having all sorts of impurities and putting themselves at huge risk, then I'm comfortable with that initial first step.
You're right, and presumably it's selling that across to people as well, that is actually going to be something that in the long run, presumably, is going to cost us less money. Guys, it's great to talk to the both of you. Thank you. Martin Hull, who's medical director at Swanswell, the Coventry and Leicestershire-based alcohol charity, and Simon Stevens, who's director of casework for Addictions UK.
We're talking shooting rooms this morning, this new idea. The Police and Crime Commissioner for County Durham, Ron Hogg, has told the BBC he wants permanent drug consumption rooms to be introduced where addicts can inject heroin and cocaine under medical supervision without the fear of persecution and prosecution. These safe rooms could help save lives. What do you think? 0191 232 6565.
What does Simon Stevens think from the charity Addictions UK? Good morning, Simon.
Good morning.
A good idea, a compassionate way of dealing with this, progressive perhaps?
It has merits in that it could help reduce bloodborne diseases and it will help reduce needle litter. The problem is that I feel that these would turn out to be rather expensive, and they're going to pull away from the somewhat reduced budget that we have now to deal with a much wider group of people who have addiction issues.
That's interesting. Just expand on that. How many people do you think this could? You think this is just going to help a very small?
I can't give specific figures because we don't really have that information to give. But if we bear in mind that addiction is not just a disease where you inject heroin, that's actually a declining number of people, and it's quite a small number of people. It covers such areas as alcohol, as prescribed medication, as to all the various different types of drugs you can get. And then you could move into behaviours like gambling and things. These are all maladjusted evolutionary traits that kind of transact with the environment. But, as your lady said earlier, the damage they cause both to individuals and massively to families, those social costs are enormous. And we really should, in my opinion, be directing what meagre budgets we have towards psychological interventions that are going to help people become abstinent from these substances and behaviours. That is where the saving is going to be, because it's going to help families, it's going to have people getting back into being part of society. It's going to help break that intergenerational learning that, you know, this kind of behaviour, it's not good. I'm a recovering addict, and I'm saying that. Yeah,
but you didn't grow up wanting to do that. It's addiction.
Absolutely not.
You know, some people would say a disease or something.
I would argue that for many people it's a disease. For some people it can be a lifestyle choice and things, but they tend to have a lot less problems with it. If you think in terms, you know, use alcohol, which people are very familiar with. Most people can drink kind of socially, and they don't have a huge problem. They might overdrink and things. It's a minority, but a substantial minority, around 10% of people potentially, who can have an addiction to that substance. We have to look at addiction and not substances. Now, I can see where Ron Hogg's coming from. If I was a police and crime commissioner, yes, I would want to alleviate the problems that I see in terms of crime and things. But that's a small part of the health problem.
But when you hear, you know, the difference it's made in Scandinavia, where it's been trialled, in Copenhagen, you know, reduced by needles on the street, reduced by tenfold, that sounds impressive to me.
Sorry, quote that statistic again, please.
Reduced by tenfold.
Reducing what?
The needles on the streets.
Well, yes, I mean, it
That's
will
quite
have
something.
That is an advantage, but you're going to have to pay a lot of money to get that. I don't disagree with that. If we had unlimited budgets, then great, do it.
Okay. Listen to this. I don't know whether you got time for a quick reaction to this, but I had a chat with Harry Shapiro earlier on in the show, and he's from Drug Scope.
We've been trialling this ourselves in this country, in Darlington and in Brighton and London. And what we've been trialling in this country is different to what's been going on, say, in Denmark, which has been on the news this morning as well. In Denmark, they have drug consumption rooms where people bring in the drugs that they brought on the streets to use under medical supervision. The trials that have been going on in this country are people who are in the treatment system, but for various reasons they haven't done very well. I mean, the methadone prescribing hasn't worked, the rehab hasn't worked. So they've been trialling if you like, a treatment of last resort for people who still need help, still want to come off drugs, but are finding it difficult. And so they undergo a pretty tough regime. They've got to turn up for regular appointments, you know, urine tests and all the rest of it. But they are prescribed heroin that they have to use, they can't take it away, on the premises under supervision. I mean, already medication is provided to use. It could be methadone, it could be buprenorphine. So we already have a system whereby substitute prescribing is used in the NHS. And this is just a kind of extension of that idea for people who need more help. I mean, the treatment system and the recovery system is very broad-based. I mean, some people go to rehab, some people go to Alcoholics Anonymous or AA and NA, and they do well. It works for them. But it's wrong to assume that the same sorts of interventions are going to work for everybody, because everybody's different. And we say that there are many ways into addiction and many paths into addiction, and we need to have as many paths out of addiction as possible.
Simon Stevens from the charity Addictions UK, does that give you a little bit more confidence in this scheme?
As I said earlier, I don't disagree with the scheme. I just think that it is going to be expensive and that it will divert funds away from a much broader group of people who currently are not getting help and should be getting help. As I said, if you're a crime commissioner, you're going to love this idea because it's going to reduce visible crime. If, however, you're really looking at the the psychological needs of people who are addicted and their families, you are really going to be saying what we really need is not kind of enabling this behaviour, but creating a situation that makes this behaviour more and more difficult.
Got you. Listen, we've got to leave it there. Simon Stevens from the charity Addictions UK, really appreciate you coming on with your point of view.
So do you think it's a good idea or not? Simon Stevens is on the line to me from Addictions UK. What do you think then, Simon?
I think it can have some merit in terms of helping control blood-borne diseases. However, I rather feel that it's going to be expensive, and we're in austerity Britain kind of thing. It's going to take money away from other forms of treatment, positive psychological interventions that can help lead to abstinence, which is surely what we all want. Whilst it will reduce costs in terms of crime, possibly, it does nothing to look at the social cost of the suffering of the individual addict, more particularly their families, the intergenerational learning that children see. This is what my parents do. They go along to this room and they use and things. We're really sort of saying that, it's okay to do this. We're enabling. The idea, and I love the idea that it is, it's supposed to be the last line of treatment and things. But I've got a feeling that once a government, if they were to invest in this, they're going to say, fine, we've spent our money on this, so therefore it is our frontline defence. If you're an addict, we're not going to treat you for your psychological problems and things. We're simply going to push you off to one side and give you free heroin. Now, that is really going to create problems. And you've already highlighted it. I mean, what people are going to wonder is, well, are we going to have drinking rooms for alcoholics, for example, or smoking rooms for people who are addicted to cigarettes?
And would that necessarily be a bad thing?
Well, it doesn't do anything to challenge the illness. I really feel that we've got to look at this from a point of view of addiction rather than of substance. Addiction is widespread in our society. We only need to look at alcohol, the problems that has, prescription drugs, for example. This particular initiative ignores the growing side of drug use, which is non-injecting heroin, which is actually non-heroin. Heroin is a falling part of the drug problem. We know from statistics that that's falling away. It's an older problem. Younger people are moving into other drugs, and that they're getting problems with those, so their needs are not being addressed. And equally, if they're addicted and need these drugs as a way of coping with their life and things, they're going to go out and steal. But, drug injecting rooms are not going to help them because they're using an entirely different sort of drug.
Yeah, well, big question. Why do people take drugs in the first place? Because most of us don't.
I would argue that it's a maladjusted evolutionary trait that's transacting with the environment. What that means is that, in very basic terms, they need drugs. They're incredibly sensitive. They find that drugs or alcohol or certain behaviours really reduce that sensitivity. That it kind of works as a medication, ironically, that many addicts and things are not doing it to get absolutely out of their heads. What they're trying to do is to medicate, but then they find once they've had one, they must have another and another.
Hang on, have I got you right, Simon? Sensitive people are more likely then to be attracted to drugs.
If you're hypersensitive, then you are going to find any emotional input to be really unpleasant. You are going to look for ways of desensitizing. That can be through behaviors. It can be through alcohol, it could be through drugs, it could be a variety of things. Certain people will find that the drugs match their neurotransmitter systems and it suits for them. in a sense, but it's a maladjusted evolutionary trait. It's something that's kind of wrong. In terms of evolution and things, we didn't evolve with heroin and cocaine and things around us. So our evolutionary systems never took that into account.
Simon, fascinating. Thank you very much. Simon Stevens. He's from Addictions UK. Keep your thoughts coming through.